They say the Whitmore estate stands where nothing should. A mansion wrapped in choking ivy, its walls leaning like the bones of some long-dead giant, deep in the misted countryside of rural England. The fog clings to it as if unwilling to let it go, swallowing its towers and chimneys until the house seems to fade from the world entirely. The air there is always colder, the light always dimmer, and no birds dare to sing in its shadow. Locals speak of the land with uneasy glances, their voices dropping to whispers as though the very mention might draw something closer. They say the ground rejects life, that roots rot faster here, that animals, even the hungriest strays, skirt the property's edge and vanish into the hedgerows rather than cross the rusted gates. Over the years, tenants have tried to claim it, none lasted longer than a month. Some left without warning, their belongings still inside, others were never seen again. The first photographs are blurry, yellowed with age, as though the camera itself resisted capturing the place. In one, the house is only half visible, the rest swallowed by a white smear of light. In another, a shadow leans in a window, the figure's outline just human enough to unsettle the mind. Diaries found in nearby attics tell of strange lights that wander the halls at night, of footsteps that follow but never overtake. One entry, written in a hurried, crooked hand, speaks only of a presence that waits in the high rooms and does not forgive. There are no official records explaining the family's fall from grace. No society papers marking their decline. It is as though someone, somewhere erased them. Yet the evidence remains in fragments, like shards of a mirror scattered through time. A property deed dated centuries ago, signed with a name that now feels heavier to say. A brittle newspaper clipping of a wedding that should have bound the Whitmores to wealth and power, but instead marked the first crack in a long and quiet ruin. And so the question grows in the silence between these scraps of history. Why did the world turn its face from the Whitmores? What happened within these walls that left them not merely forgotten, but deliberately cut out of polite memory? The house stands still, the ivy clutching tighter each year, and in the mist the answer waits. The Whitmore name first appeared in parish records in the winter of 1672, a single line in a ledger noting the purchase of land no one else had wanted. From there, their history does not rise in splendor as with noble houses, but sinks inward, curling in on itself like a vine deprived of sunlight. They were never public figures, never patrons of great works or leaders in war. Instead, they kept to their estate, their dealings quiet, their wealth untouched by the eyes of strangers. Some called them shrewd, others called them secretive. And behind closed doors, there were whispers that their fortune was not earned through trade or toil, but through older, darker arrangements. Rumors grew of the Whitmore's association with groups whose names were not spoken aloud in daylight. There were accounts of late-night visitors arriving in carriages with no lanterns, of letters written in ink so black it bled through the page. The family tree tells the rest in uneasy detail. It stretches back through centuries, each branch marked with births and deaths, but the dates tell a stranger story. Whole lines end without warning. Young men cut down in their 20s, young women gone before they reached childbearing age. In the parish register, the cause is always the same: illness. Yet the accompanying notes hint at fevers without heat, bleeding without wounds, and faces described as marked by shadows in their final days. The Whitmores rarely looked outside their own blood for marriage. Cousins wed cousins, distant relations bound together in an ever-tightening circle. At first, it seemed a way to keep the estate whole, but over the years, it fed quieter fears that the line was turning in on itself too far, that something unseen was being carried forward from generation to generation. Old letters from neighboring families speak of pale children with eyes too old for their years, of strange birth defects kept from public view, of heirs who vanished before they could inherit. And then there are the names no longer visible. The yellowed parchment of the family tree bears dark scars where certain entries have been scratched away with violent force, the ink torn from the page entirely. It is as if someone believed erasing them would erase what they had done, or what they had become. The paper feels brittle, ready to crumble at the touch, yet the spaces where the names should be draw the gaze more than the names that remain. Looking at it, one can't help but wonder what happened to those who were cut out, and who decided they should be forgotten. It was a warm evening in the summer of 1783 when Eliza Whitmore was last seen. She was 17, the youngest daughter of a family already wrapped in quiet dread, her beauty remarked upon by villagers who rarely caught sight of her. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eliza was seen walking toward the eastern woods that bordered the estate. She wore no shoes. Her pale dress trailed in the dirt, and her hair was unbound, moving like a shadow behind her. Those who saw her from the lane said she was humming, a thin, lilting melody that none could place, the kind that seems familiar and yet has no name. She did not return. At first, it was thought she had wandered too far and lost her way, but the eastern woods were well known to her. She had grown up playing there, slipping between the twisted oaks and the thorn-thick hedges with the ease of someone who belonged. Her mother's reaction was not grief, not fear, but something colder. When pressed, she would only say that Eliza had been taken back. No one knew what she meant, and no one dared to ask twice. The search began the next morning. Men from the village combed the forest with lanterns, their light pooling in the damp hollows between the trees. The air inside was strangely still, muffling every sound except the crunch of their boots. Hours passed before they found anything. A scrap of blue ribbon caught in the brambles, frayed and dirty, the sort Eliza often wore in her hair. Beyond that, there was nothing. No tracks, no torn cloth, no sign of struggle. Whispers began to spread before the search was even called off. Some claimed to have heard her song in the forest days later, drifting low and far between the trees. Others swore they saw her figure at dusk, standing at the edge of the orchard, her feet bare and her eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. Each sighting faded as quickly as it came, leaving only unease in its wake. In the Whitmore family records, her disappearance is marked with a single line: "Lost, Midsummer, 1783. No cause, no burial, no memorial, just lost." The space where her life should have unfolded remains empty, like a room locked forever. And still, the eastern woods stand as they did then, dark, patient, and waiting. The eastern wing was not part of the original Whitmore house. It rose in 1810, an addition of pale stone that caught the morning light in a way the rest of the mansion never did. From the outside, it looked almost graceful. Tall windows, narrow balconies, and a long gallery that overlooked the gardens. But almost from the moment it was completed, the servants began to talk. At night, when the wing was locked and the family asleep, there were sounds, soft voices too low to make out, drifting through the hallways when no one was inside. The tones were strange, measured, deliberate, as though in the middle of some careful discussion. More than one servant claimed to have paused outside a door, hearing the faint scrape of chairs and the rustle of movement, only to open it and find an empty, dark room. Other nights, candlelight flickered behind those tall windows long after the household had gone quiet. The light moved slowly from one end of the gallery to the other, as if carried by an unseen hand. Once, a footman swore he saw a figure standing in one of the windows, perfectly still, the candle's flame unshaken by any breeze. When he returned with another to look again, the window was empty and the room beyond locked from the inside. The most haunting account came years later, when an old maid's diary was discovered in a box of discarded clothes. In one brittle, water-stained entry, she wrote of cleaning the eastern wing alone one afternoon. The air, she said, felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. Every step she took, she felt eyes on her, not from the doorway or the corners, but from inside the very walls. She left before finishing her work that day, and never entered the wing again. By 1845, whatever had begun there reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. No official reason was given, but workmen arrived one morning and began sealing the entire eastern wing. Doors were boarded, corridors blocked, and the tall windows bricked over until the exterior was a blank, lifeless wall. The dust of construction drifted through the house for weeks, but the work was never spoken of. Even the family avoided the subject, as though acknowledging it would give something inside the right to speak back. Now the eastern wing stands silent, its walls thick with decades of dust, its rooms untouched by light. But sometimes, on a still night, the villagers say they can see a faint glow pressing against the bricked windows, as if something inside has never stopped waiting. Jonathan Whitmore was 12 when the first signs appeared. At first they seemed harmless, moments where his gaze would drift away during supper, fixed on some far corner of the room. But the pauses grew longer, his eyes glassy and unblinking, as though watching something no one else could see. Servants whispered that his lips moved during these spells, shaping words they did not recognize. Some swore the language was old, older than the house itself, a rolling cadence that sent a shiver through anyone who overheard. Then came the drawings. Chalk marks began appearing on the floors and walls of the mansion, intricate geometric patterns, repeating shapes within shapes, spirals that seemed to turn in on themselves. Jonathan would spend hours crouched in silence, his hands moving without pause, his eyes fixed on the lines as if following instructions only he could hear. When asked about them, he would look away and murmur that they had to be perfect, or it would come too soon. Physicians were brought in from London. They examined him, took notes, argued in hushed tones. Some called it a rare illness of the mind. Others claimed hysteria, or a form of seizure unknown to medicine. But none could explain the strange language, or why Jonathan seemed to wake in the mornings with dirt under his nails and damp leaves tangled in his hair. One doctor, a quiet man with tired eyes, left behind a letter never meant for the family. In it, he wrote only one sentence that stood apart from the rest of his report. The boy has been chosen. By the time Jonathan was 17, whatever afflicted him had hollowed him out. He no longer spoke to anyone for days at a time. He wandered the halls barefoot, muttering to himself, sometimes pausing in front of a bricked-up doorway in the eastern wing, pressing his ear to the stone as though listening for a reply. His father, grim and silent, eventually ordered him confined to the attic. The windows there were boarded from the inside, and the door was kept locked. Jonathan died a year later. The official record states consumption, a common enough cause, though no doctor attended him in his final days. There was no autopsy, no funeral in the village, only a quiet burial somewhere on the estate grounds. Still, some claim that on cold nights, chalk marks appear again in the attic's dust, drawn by hands no longer living. The winter of 1874 came early to the Whitmore estate. By mid-November, frost clung to the trees like a shroud, and the sun seemed reluctant to rise. The days bled into one another under a sky the color of ash, and then, without warning, the fog arrived. It did not drift in from the low fields or roll down from the hills like a normal mist. It came all at once, thick and wet, swallowing the grounds until even the gates could not be seen from the house. It clung to skin like breath from something too close. Within the first week, the first servant was found dead in the stables. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle, only a face locked in an expression of such terror that those who found him could not bear to look for long. The second death came days later. A maid discovered on the back steps in the early morning, her body stiff and her hands curled into fists. By the time the third was found, an older cook slumped over the kitchen table. Fear had rooted itself deep into every corner of the house. The livestock fared no better. Horses were found in their stalls, throats torn and eyes wide. Chickens lay scattered in the mud, their bodies oddly twisted, as though gripped by something that did not let go until the life had left them. No tracks were found in the snow, only the faint marks of hooves or claws that began and ended abruptly. The surviving servants refused to step outside after dusk, and the Whitmore family themselves rarely left their rooms. Meals were taken behind closed doors, curtains drawn, fires left to burn long into the night. The silence inside the house was almost worse than the fog beyond it. From this time, a single journal survives, its leather cover warped from damp. Inside are sketches that defy comfort, half-formed faces staring through the fog, long skeletal shapes that seem to blend into the mist itself. The drawings grow more frantic as the weeks pass, the lines heavy and dark, the shapes pressing closer. In one corner of a page, a single sentence is scrawled, "It waits at the edge of the orchard." The fog lingered for nearly a month before it began to thin, revealing the estate grounds in a pale, sickly light. No explanation was ever found, but the villagers remembered, and when winter returned in the years that followed, they kept their distance, watching the mansion from afar, waiting to see if the fog would come again. It was the summer of 1891, when a boy from the village, no more than 16, claimed he had seen something in the Whitmore orchard that should never have been seen. He had been walking home late, skirting the edge of the estate to save time, when a strange sound reached him through the stillness. It was not singing, though it rose and fell like song. It was lower, heavier, as if many voices were speaking in one slow, deliberate breath. The moon was high, spilling pale light over the twisted apple trees. Between their gnarled trunks, he saw them a circle of figures, tall and rigid, their faces veiled in thin black cloth that shivered faintly in the breeze. The shapes were unmistakably human, yet the way they stood, shoulders squared, heads tilted at unnatural angles, made them seem like something else entirely. At the center of the circle, a single candle burned, its flame bending as though resisting the air around it. The chanting grew deeper, each syllable curling into the night, like smoke. The boy could not understand the words, but he felt them in his chest, heavy and slow, as if they were not meant to be heard, but to be carried inside. His courage broke when one of the veiled heads turned toward him, though the rest of the body did not move. He fled without looking back. In the days that followed, the orchard changed. The fruit, nearly ripe, blackened on the branch, skins wrinkling as if drained of life overnight. The ground beneath the trees grew soft and foul-smelling, and the air there turned oddly warm even in the morning chill. A well near the orchard, one the village had used for generations, was found tainted. Its water ran thick and dark, with a bitter metallic taste that burned the throat. The clergy, alarmed by the boy's story and the sudden decay, came to bless the grounds. They arrived with scripture, holy water, and the conviction that faith could cleanse whatever had taken root there. But when they reached the gates, they found the Whitmore men waiting, rifles in hand. The blessing was never given. The orchard remained untouched after that. No one from the village dared approach, and the Whitmores themselves seemed to avoid it, as though their purpose there had been fulfilled. Still, on certain nights, the wind through the apple trees carried a sound that was not quite rustling leaves, a low, steady murmur that no one dared to follow. They were found by chance, tucked deep between the laths and plaster of a second-floor wall during a long-abandoned renovation. A bundle of letters, their envelopes yellowed and brittle, bound together with a length of rotted twine. None had ever been sent. Each was addressed in the same hand to a Mr. H. in London, the ink faded, but still legible, the writing tense and hurried. The first spoke of sleepless nights, of a sound that would rise through the silence after the house had settled. Not footsteps, not the creak of timber in the wind, but something heavier, slower, deliberate. It moves, the writer confessed, as if searching for the right room. Another letter described the well at the far edge of the property. The family had not used it in years, but the writer claimed to hear voices echoing up from its depths at night. Not words exactly, but the suggestion of them, shapes of sound that hovered at the edge of meaning, as though waiting to be understood. With each letter, the tone shifted from unease to desperation. "I no longer walk the halls alone," one read. "Its shape changes. It presses against the walls like water." Another ended with the line, "I saw it pass by my door." The light bent around it. The paper there was smudged, as if the pen had dragged through trembling fingers. The final letters were torn, the sentences cut short, as though the writer had been pulled from the desk mid-thought. One ends with only 3 words, "It is here," followed by a jagged tear in the paper. The name at the bottom, in every letter, was blurred into a dark stain. Whether it was done by the writer or by another hand, no one could say. Who Mr. H was remains a mystery. No records link such a name to the Whitmores in that period, though there are theories: an associate in London, a former ally, perhaps even a confessor, but the letters never reached him. They stayed hidden in the walls, the paper curling inward as if trying to hide itself from view, until they were uncovered decades later. By then, the rooms where they were written had long been empty, though some who handled them swore the paper felt faintly warm to the touch. Margaret and Abigail Whitmore came into the world on a grey morning in 1919, born within minutes of each other. From the beginning, the 2 girls were inseparable. They moved together, played together, and even seemed to breathe in time. The nurses who attended their birth claimed they made the same strange cooing sound, neither quite crying nor laughing, a sound they would continue to make in each other's company for years. By the time they could speak, it became clear they had invented a language of their own, soft syllables and quick rhythmic sounds that no one else could decipher. When addressed in English, they would glance at each other first, as though deciding together whether to answer. Visitors to the estate noticed something else. Under certain light, most often at dusk, the twins' eyes would shift in color, pale blue one moment, and almost gray-green the next, and always changing in perfect unison. It was never sudden, but slow, like watching a storm cloud pass over water. Those who witnessed it often found themselves looking away, unsettled without knowing why. For 8 years the twins were rarely seen apart. That ended on a still summer afternoon when Abigail was found in the estate's pond. The water was calm, unbroken by wind, and her body lay just beneath the surface, her hair spreading like ink in the water. There were no signs of struggle. Some said she had simply wandered too close. Others whispered that she had been pulled. Margaret was the one who found her. Servants recalled her standing silently at the water's edge, her dress hem wet, her gaze fixed on the ripples as if waiting for them to still. She did not cry. She did not speak. From that day on, she never spoke again. Over the years, Margaret withdrew into herself entirely. She ate only when prompted, walked only when guided. In photographs from this time, she appears as a pale, thin figure in white dresses, always staring just past the camera, her eyes unfocused and glassy. In some, the faintest hint of a smile lingers, though it never reaches her eyes. She lived like this for decades, outlasting her parents, outlasting most who had known the twins in life. Those who cared for her in her final years said she would sometimes rise in the night and stand at her window looking toward the pond. And if the moon was bright, her lips would move, not in words anyone could understand, but in that same secret language she once shared with her sister. Between 1927 and 1934, the Whitmore estate gained a quiet, sinister rhythm. One by one, the servants began to disappear. There was no announcement, no formal notice, only the sudden absence of familiar faces. The cook who had worked there for 15 years, the young footman barely out of boyhood, the quiet laundress who kept her eyes down. Their names vanished from the payroll as if they had never been there at all. No missing persons reports were filed. The village constable claimed he had received no complaints, though some whispered that the Whitmore's influence kept such matters from reaching his desk. Those who remained in service at the house refused to speak openly of it, even years later. Only in private, when the lamps were low and the doors locked, did they admit what they had seen or thought they had seen. One maid recalled waking in the small hours to the sound of a scream, high and sudden, as if torn from someone in the next room. She ran to the hall, but it was empty. The sound had not come from her floor at all. It had come from the eastern wing, sealed and bricked decades earlier. Another servant claimed the doors to certain rooms would lock themselves at night. Keys would turn in the locks without hands on them, trapping whoever was inside until dawn. Those unlucky enough to spend the night in such a room described hearing faint breathing in the dark, close enough to stir the hair at the back of the neck. There were rumors that the disappearances happened more often during the colder months, when the orchard was bare and the nights were long. One stable hand swore he saw a fellow servant led toward the bricked-up eastern wing by a figure he thought was the master of the house, only to find that the master had been in town all that day. He never saw the servant again. The Whitmores themselves offered no explanation. When questioned by tradesmen or distant relatives, they would smile politely, deflect, and change the subject. It was as if the missing had been written out of the story entirely. And perhaps that was the point. By 1934, the staff had thinned so much that parts of the estate fell into disuse. Still, those who left the Whitmores behind carried with them the memory of nights when the air seemed to hum with something unseen, and of screams that faded too quickly to be human. The mirror room was hidden deep within the Whitmore mansion, behind a narrow, unremarkable door in a seldom-used corridor. Few in the village even knew it existed, and those who did spoke of it only in fragments, as though saying too much might draw it nearer. The chamber itself was perfectly circular, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with mirrors. Time had dimmed their surfaces, leaving them clouded and greenish at the edges, but they still caught the light in strange, fractured ways. Step inside, and you would see yourself multiplied a dozen times over, each image bending just slightly, as if the mirrors had their own idea of what you should look like. No one knew why the room had been built. There were no records of its construction, no mention of it in the plans for the house. Servants claimed the Whitmores rarely went there, though some swore they heard the door close softly in the small hours. Local law took on its own shape, that anyone who entered the mirror room after midnight would not see themselves as they were, but as something else wanted them to be. More chilling still, the story went that your reflection would not always move when you did. In the summer of 1942, a soldier home on leave heard the tale in the village and took it as a challenge. He was young, loud with drink, and certain the Whitmore legends were nothing but old country nonsense. On a dare, he found his way inside the mansion one night, slipping through a side door left unlocked. He was last seen by a friend just before midnight, grinning as he stepped into the mirror room, a lantern in hand. When they found him the next morning, he was lying on the floor in the center of the chamber. His eyes were wide open, his mouth slightly parted, and there was no mark on him. The doctor called it a sudden failure of the heart, though the soldier had been in perfect health. The friend who dared him swore he had seen something else through the open door, in the mirrors, something that still moved even after the soldier had fallen. Villagers tell it differently still. They say his reflection continued to blink for several minutes after his body went still, and if you look long enough at the tarnished glass, you might find that it still does. The fire began in the dead of night, in the winter of 1953. By the time the first villagers saw the orange glow rising behind the Whitmore estate's black silhouette, the flames had already begun to consume the mansion's upper floors. The alarm was raised, and a crew of firefighters arrived to find the heat rolling off the building in waves so intense it forced them to shield their faces even from a distance. They would later say it was unlike any heat they had ever felt, thick, heavy, almost alive. The blaze raged for hours, devouring rooms filled with centuries of the Whitmore family's history. Portraits turned to ash. Entire shelves of leather-bound journals collapsed into smoldering heaps, and ornate furniture cracked apart under the weight of the flames. The fire moved with strange precision, skipping over some areas entirely while reducing others to blackened ruin. When the embers cooled, it was found that the eastern wing, the very place the fire investigators traced as the point of origin, remained untouched. Its bricked windows and sealed doors were unmarked by soot. the pale stone cool to the touch. Those who fought the fire spoke of another detail, one that never made it into the official report. As they forced their way inside, they swore they heard something beneath the roar of the flames. At first, they thought it was the crack of timber splitting, but it grew sharper, higher, like voices screaming from within the walls themselves. It was not a single cry, but many weaving together, echoing along the corridors, until the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Whitmores emerged from the chaos unharmed, though their faces were pale and drawn. When questioned, they blamed faulty wiring in the attic, dismissing any suggestion of something more deliberate. But electricians who examined the remaining fixtures found no sign of short circuits or frayed cables. In fact, they found nothing at all to explain how the blaze had started, no accelerants, no sparks, no lightning strike. The eastern wing remained sealed in the aftermath, its clean, cold surface standing in stark contrast to the charred wreckage around it. In the months that followed, the Whitmores avoided speaking of the fire altogether, yet some villagers claimed that on cold nights, when the wind carries just right, the mansion still smells faintly of smoke, and if you stand at the base of the eastern wall, you might hear the faintest sound of something still screaming to get out. The Whitmore estate had not hosted a wedding in decades, when, in the spring of 1961, the family announced that Eleanor Whitmore would be married. The groom, a wealthy industrialist from the city, was spoken of as a practical match, an alliance of money and influence. Yet, from the moment the guests arrived, something about the celebration felt wrong. The day itself was bright but cold, the kind of brittle light that bleaches color from everything it touches. The ceremony was held in the great hall, its high windows draped in heavy curtains that allowed only thin ribbons of daylight inside. Guests would later recall how the air felt stale, heavy with the scent of old flowers, and how neither bride nor groom ever truly smiled. Eleanor kept her gaze lowered through much of the vows, her pale hands clasped tight around the bouquet, while the groom's skin had a faint sheen of sweat, as though he were unwell. The reception was no livelier. There was music, but it played too softly, swallowed by the size of the room. The few toasts offered were brief, awkward things. Servants moved through the crowd without meeting anyone's eye. One guest claimed that as the couple shared their first dance, Eleanor's lips were moving, whispering something close to the groom's ear. Whatever she said, it left him white as paper. They left for their honeymoon the next morning, though no one in the village ever saw them depart. By the end of the year, the news came quietly. The groom was dead. The official cause was a sudden cerebral hemorrhage, but there was no mention of illness beforehand, no warning. He had been 38 years old. What happened next was the subject of hushed speculation for years. Eleanor did not appear at the funeral. She did not appear anywhere at all. The Whitmore gates stayed shut, and tradesmen who delivered to the house claimed to hear the sound of footsteps in an upstairs room at night, slow, steady pacing. Some whispered that Eleanor had kept her husband's body there for weeks, perhaps longer, locked away from the world. By the following spring, the room was sealed, its windows boarded from the inside. Eleanor withdrew fully into the mansion's shadowed halls, her life from then on marked by absence. And with her, the last Whitmore wedding faded into something far stranger than a family celebration, another thread in a history already knotted too tightly to ever unravel. In the autumn of 1975, a locksmith was called to the Whitmore estate to open an antique desk that had been found locked for decades. The wood was dark with age, its brass fittings dulled to green, and the key long since lost. It took the locksmith nearly an hour to coax the mechanism open, the tumblers grinding like something reluctant to give way. Inside, beneath a scattering of yellowed papers, lay a small diary bound in cracked black leather. The cover was stiff, the edges worn to softness by hands long gone. The handwriting inside was frantic, the letters slanting as though written in haste, the ink blotched and uneven. The first entries spoke of dreams, dreams of being pulled beneath black water, of sinking slowly while pale hands reached up from the depths. The writer described waking with the taste of brackish water in their mouth and the feeling of silt clinging to their skin. As the weeks passed, the entries grew darker. The writer claimed to wake in the middle of the night to find muddy footprints beside the bed, the damp smell of the orchard drifting in through closed windows. Sometimes they heard a low creak in the floorboards, as though someone was standing just beyond the reach of the lamp's light. Other times there was a tapping, slow, steady, on the walls near the headboard. One passage described the shadow in the orchard, a figure glimpsed only between the trees. At first it was distant, but each time the writer saw it, it seemed closer. They described it as tall, indistinct, as though shaped from mist, with a presence that pressed against the chest and made it hard to breathe. "It watches," they wrote. "It waits for me to be alone." The final entry was shorter than the rest, the lines jagged and uneven. "It is here in my room, watching me." The pen mark trails off in a long slash across the page, as though pulled away mid-word. There are no more entries after that. No one can say for certain what happened to the diary. The locksmith who found it left the estate that evening with the book wrapped in a cloth, intending to deliver it to the family the next day. He never arrived. His home was found empty, his tools still laid out on the kitchen table. The diary was never seen again. Some say the last person to touch it is still out there, wandering, and that whatever was in that room in the final entry followed him when he left. Room 6 was never meant for guests. It was small compared to the grander chambers of the Whitmore estate, its single window facing the orchard, its walls papered in a faded floral pattern that seemed to wilt with time. Yet through the late 20th century, it gained a strange reputation among those few invited to stay the night. They would emerge pale, restless, speaking in half-finished sentences about the things they had felt, heard, or seen. The first complaint was always the heat. Even in the dead of winter, with no radiator in the room and frost thick on the glass, the air would press heavy and warm against the skin. It was the kind of heat that made breathing feel like an effort, as though the room itself were alive and exhaling against the lungs. Sleep offered no escape. Guests often woke with red scratches on their arms and shoulders, thin, deliberate lines that stung to the touch. Then, there was the sound. More than one visitor spoke of waking in the night to the slow, uneven rasp of breathing. Not their own, not even close. It came from the dark corner near the wardrobe, or from just beyond the foot of the bed. No matter how quickly they turned on the light, the sound would stop, leaving only the thick heat and the certainty they had not been alone. In the late 1980s, a local historian decided to investigate. He requested to stay in room 6, bringing with him a small tape recorder. He announced his intention to capture the truth, whether it was the wind, the settling of the house, or something more. The recording ran for over 7 hours. For most of that time, it captured nothing but silence, the occasional creak of old floorboards, and the historians shifting in bed. But just after 3 in the morning, the silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from inside the wall, near the head of the bed. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 again, steady as a metronome. The historian did not stir. The tapping continued for nearly 20 minutes before fading into stillness. The man left the estate the following day without explanation, his face drawn and pale. When asked about the recording, he only said he had destroyed it. Yet those who had heard a copy before it vanished swore that, beneath the tapping, there was something else, a sound so faint it was almost not there, the slow, measured rasp of someone breathing in the dark. Philip Whitmore was 35 when the estate became his in 1988, the last surviving member of a family whose name had long since faded from polite conversation. To those who knew him, he seemed determined to bring the place back to life. He spoke of restoring the old rooms, of clearing the orchard, of repairing what decades of neglect had allowed to rot. But he worked only at night. The villagers would see the faint glow of lamps moving from room to room long after midnight, never in the daylight hours. Deliveries were left at the gate and collected only after dusk. Friends who called received no answer, their messages unanswered until eventually they stopped trying. Curtains stayed drawn in every window, even in the height of summer. It was the orchard that seemed to hold him most. More than once those passing by on the road swore they saw him there in the small hours, walking slow circles among the twisted trees. Sometimes he would stop and stand perfectly still for minutes at a time, his head tilted slightly as if listening. Other times his lips moved, whispering words too low to carry, his breath clouding in the moonlight. On one occasion, a farmhand cutting through a field swore he heard Philip laugh softly, though no one else was with him. By 1990, the estate was no more welcoming than before. The repairs never seemed to progress, at least not in ways visible from the outside. Tiles remained broken, shutters hung crooked, and weeds still grew thick at the gates. Inside, however, faint movements could be glimpsed from the road, shadows crossing rooms, the faint tremor of light in windows that should have been empty. In the summer of 1991, Philip disappeared. There was no warning, no sign of struggle. His car remained in the drive, his clothes in the wardrobe, his wallet on the desk. The bed was made, and the only disturbance in the dust was a single trail of footprints leading from the kitchen door toward the orchard, and stopping halfway there. Search parties combed the grounds, but nothing was found. The orchard was silent, its air thick and still, the trees heavy with fruit that year, though none dared touch it. The estate fell into disrepair soon after, its windows dark, its gates rusting shut, and somewhere beyond them, the orchard still waits, holding whatever it was Philip listened to when the rest of the world was asleep. After Philip Whitmore's disappearance, the estate stood silent. No one came to claim it. No caretakers. No distant relatives. No curious buyers. The gates sagged on rusting hinges, and the driveway cracked under years of frost and neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters. Roof slates slipped loose and shattered in the weeds, and ivy climbed higher over the stone, tightening its grip as though trying to pull the house back into the earth. Yet even as time wore on, something about the place resisted the final surrender to nature. Vandals were the first to test its stillness. Teenagers from the village crept through broken windows, flashlights trembling in their hands. They would scrawl their names in the dust, throw stones through the few unbroken panes, dare one another to step into the orchard. Most didn't stay long. More than one returned pale, speaking of footsteps that echoed just behind them, quickening when they quickened, stopping when they turned. Others swore they saw pale faces peering down from the upper windows, watching, unblinking, though the rooms above were empty. Perhaps most unsettling was the absence of life. No birds nested in the eaves, no foxes crossed the lawn, no stray cat was ever seen on the property. The orchard, once heavy with gnarled fruit, remained barren year after year. Even weeds refused to grow near the old well at the edge of the grounds. The soil there was bare, cracked, as though scorched long ago. On still days, some said they could hear a faint hollow echo rising from its depths, but no one leaned close enough to be certain. In the early 2000s, the estate drew the attention of urban explorers. They came armed with cameras, eager to document the ruin. Some footage surfaced online, grainy clips of dark hallways and decaying staircases, the beams of flashlights glancing off damp, peeling wallpaper. In one video, a door at the end of a corridor swings open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. In another, a faint shape seems to cross a doorway in the distance, too quick and too tall to be human. Much of the footage was abruptly deleted within days of being posted. Those who uploaded it gave no reason, some deleting their accounts entirely. The estate returned to silence, left to its slow collapse. Yet anyone passing on the road after dusk might still feel it, that pull in the chest, that prickling on the back of the neck, as if the house knows when it's being watched, and wants to watch back. The well stands at the farthest edge of the Whitmore estate, where the orchard gives way to a thinning of trees and the land begins to slope. Built from weathered stone, its circular lip is slick with moss, the rope pulley long since rotted away. No one knows exactly how deep it runs, only that it swallows light long before the bottom can be seen. The villagers say it was there before the house, before the orchard, perhaps before the land even bore the Whitmore name. For as long as anyone can remember, the well has been tied to disappearances. Old parish records speak of a farmhand in the 1700s who was last seen walking toward it at dusk. In 1841, a serving girl from the estate vanished on her way to fetch water, her empty bucket found resting neatly on the stones. By the early 20th century, the Whitmores no longer used the well, though it remained uncovered. Those who passed too close swore they felt a strange pull, as if the air itself were urging them to lean over and look inside. In 2004, a team of curious locals decided to test it. They lowered a microphone deep into the shaft, the cable unwinding for what felt like minutes. When they played back the recording, the static was faint, but underneath it was something else, soft, overlapping whispers, as though many voices were speaking at once. The words, if they were words, were impossible to make out. The same day, water samples were drawn. Laboratory results noted unusually high levels of organic material, but none of it could be matched to known plant or animal life. The most unsettling tales belong to those who tried to descend. Over the years, a handful of explorers, driven by curiosity, bravado, or something harder to name, have lowered themselves into the shaft. Some returned pale and shaking, unwilling to speak of what they'd seen. Others never came back at all. Their ropes, when hauled up, were slick and frayed, as if something below had dragged across them. The villagers keep their distance now. They say the well must be fed, though no one will explain exactly what that means. On windless nights, a faint sound still rises from its depths, a murmur that seems almost to call a name. No one lingers long enough to hear if it calls again. In the late summer of 2011, something changed in the Whitmore orchard. For decades, the gnarled apple trees had stood barren, their twisted branches clutching at the air like skeletal hands. But that year, villagers noticed the branches sagging under the weight of fruit. From a distance, it seemed like a miracle, a sudden burst of life in a place long thought dead. Up close, it was something else entirely. The apples were small, shriveled things, their skins black and wrinkled as if rotting from the inside out. When touched, they left a dark residue on the fingers, and their smell was sharp, foul, almost chemical. No birds came to peck at them, no insects landed on their skins. The air between the rows of trees hung heavy, thick with the cloying stench. Word spread quickly among the village youth. One night, a group of them slipped through the rusted gates to see the orchard for themselves. They returned in the early hours, pale and shaking. One girl claimed she had seen faces in the apples, distorted, mouthless faces, their eyes fixed on her. Another boy said he heard whispering that seemed to come from inside the fruit, the words sliding just out of reach, no matter how hard he tried to listen. By the next day, some of them had nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. One woke screaming in the middle of the night, insisting that the orchard was in his room, its branches scraping the ceiling. Another, quiet, withdrawn, collapsed into a sudden, violent, psychotic break, clawing at his own skin, as if trying to remove something that wasn't there. A few days later, footage began circulating online. It showed shaky night vision, the grain of the camera cutting through the blackness between the trees. The group's laughter is uneasy, their voices low. Then, from the corner of the frame, something moves, tall, impossibly tall, its shape indistinct but fast. The camera jerks, and there's a gasp, then silence. The figure is gone, but the branches sway violently, as if brushed by something massive passing through. The video was taken down within hours. Copies that remained were blurred, distorted, as though whatever had been caught on film resisted being seen. The apples rotted where they hung, falling to the ground in thick, wet thuds, and the smell of them lingered in the orchard for months. By winter, the branches were bare again, but no one in the village believed the orchard had gone back to sleep. In the spring of 2015, a regional archivist was combing through the county's forgotten storage rooms, searching for material on historic missing persons cases. The records were dusty, the shelves bowed under decades of neglect. In the far corner, beneath a stack of unlabeled ledgers, he found a sealed wooden box, its lid nailed shut, and its surface marked with faint water-warped stains. There was no catalogue entry for it, no tag, no reference in the archive's inventory. When he pried it open, the smell of old paper and something faintly sour rose into the air. Inside, beneath a layer of brittle newsprint, lay a stack of documents bound with fraying twine. There were sketches, dozens of them, drawn in ink so dark it had barely faded. The figures were not quite human. Limbs too long, heads too narrow, eyes depicted as hollow circles. Some were shown standing in the orchard, others peering from the bricked windows of the eastern wing. The style was detailed but frantic, as if the artist had been trying to record them before they vanished. Beneath the sketches was a map of the Whitmore estate, its paths and structures marked in precise hand. Certain areas were circled in red ink, overlaid with symbols the archivist could not identify, intricate loops and intersecting lines that seemed to echo the geometric patterns Jonathan Whitmore had once drawn in chalk. In one corner, a notation read simply, "Convergence points." There were also receipts, yellowed and brittle, for shipments from overseas ports. The items listed were vague: preserved specimens, organic material, sealed glass containers, fragile. The destinations were always the Whitmore estate, though the sender's name was never the same twice. At the very bottom of the box was a single letter. The paper was heavier than the others, the ink a deep brown. It was addressed to my brothers below and written in a formal, almost ceremonial tone. The letter spoke of preparations of gatherings in shadowed places and of the offering as promised before the turn of the season. It hinted at connections beyond England, to others keeping the same rights in distant lands. A week after the discovery, the archivist's home burned to the ground. The fire was swift and total, leaving nothing but the brick shell of the building. The box and its contents were never found among the ruins. Those who knew him say he had seemed distracted in his final days, glancing often at the shadows in the corners of rooms, as if he expected something to be there. In the summer of 2018, a development company purchased the Whitmore estate with plans to convert it into luxury apartments. For the first time in decades, the gates were thrown open, and work crews began clearing the overgrown drive, boarding up broken windows, and hauling away debris. The developers spoke confidently to the press about preserving the property's historic charm. But the villagers who watched from the road knew the house would not give itself up so easily. The project moved quickly at first, until they reached the eastern wing. The bricked facade, sealed since 1845, was marked on the plans for removal. It took 3 days to chip through the thick stone, the workers remarking on how strange it was that the mortar seemed newer in places, as if someone had repaired the seal more than once over the years. When the final layer gave way, they stepped into a long corridor, heavy with dust. The air was dry, stale, and cold, despite the summer heat. Room by room, the workers found walls covered in murals, the paint cracked and curling, but still vivid in places. The scenes were of the orchard, tree after twisted tree, but each branch bore not apples, but human faces, dozens of them, some with eyes closed, some open, their expressions caught between anguish and serenity. The paint had been applied in such fine strokes that even beneath the decay, the faces seemed almost alive. At the far end of the corridor was a chamber larger than the rest. In its center stood a single wooden chair, angled toward a tall, cracked mirror that leaned against the far wall. The glass was fogged in patches, fractured lines spidering through its surface. No one wanted to approach it. One worker swore he saw movement in its reflection, a shadow slipping between the painted trees, though the room itself was still. It was then that someone noticed the floor. The dust lay thick and undisturbed, everywhere, except for a single trail of footprints. They led from the doorway straight to the chair, stopping directly before it. The impressions were fresh, the edges sharp, as though made only moments before the wall was broken. Work stopped that afternoon. By the next morning, the developers had ordered the eastern wing closed off again. No explanation was given, and the project slowed to a crawl. The windows of the eastern wing remain dark, but those who pass at night say they sometimes catch a faint gleam from the cracks in the brickwork, like light bouncing from a mirror deep inside. By 2021, the Whitmore estate had been quiet for years. The failed development project had left it half-gutted, its walls stripped bare in places, its grounds littered with forgotten equipment. Yet in the stillness, new stories began to surface. People passing on the road after dark spoke of a lone figure moving slowly through the overgrown grass, its pale face catching the moonlight before vanishing into shadow. Some swore it was Philip Whitmore, unchanged from the day he disappeared 3 decades before. The accounts were easy to dismiss at first, local gossip, the kind that clings to places with long, unsettling histories. But then came the security footage. A private guard hired to watch the property set up cameras around the perimeter, their feeds monitored from a small on-site office. One night in late autumn, the guard returned from a brief patrol to find one of the cameras frozen on a strange image, a man standing at the edge of the old well. The figure didn't move. He didn't pace or turn his head. He simply stood there, head bowed slightly, as if listening. Hours passed, and he remained in place. Then, between one frame and the next, he was gone. There was no blur of movement, no shadow of him leaving, only the empty stones of the well in the pale light. The footage spread quietly among the crew, and within weeks, the developers announced they were halting all work. Their official statement cited unforeseen safety concerns, but no one could say what that meant. The guards were dismissed. The equipment was removed. The gates were locked once more. In the months that followed, the estate seemed to sink deeper into silence, but the orchard did not. It began to grow in a way that defied reason. The trees thickened, their branches weaving together overhead until the rows became tunnels of shade. Grass rose in tangled waves around their roots, yet the fruit came early, small, dark, and foul-smelling. The air between the trees felt warmer than the rest of the grounds, heavy enough to make breathing slow. From the road, passers-by sometimes glimpsed movement within the orchard. Not the quick dart of animals, but the slow shifting of shapes, too tall to be men, gliding between the trunks. Whether Philip walks among them now, no one can say. But the orchard thrives, and the rest of the estate waits, listening for footsteps that never truly left. The story of the Whitmore family, when laid out in full, does not read like the history of a cursed house so much as the record of a bargain kept for generations. The disappearances, the sealed rooms, the whispers in the orchard, none of it appears random when seen through the eyes of those who study the darker corners of history. The Whitmores were not merely unlucky, nor were they passive victims of some nameless haunting. They were participants. Occult scholars speak of spaces built with intention, where each element serves a purpose in a larger design. The orchard, they say, may have been more than a source of fruit. Its layout, when mapped, mirrors certain ritual diagrams found in centuries-old texts, with the trees marking points in a pattern meant to channel or contain. The well, older than the house itself, may have been the heart of that pattern, a point of offering or of passage depending on which interpretation you believe. And the eastern wing, with its bricked windows and painted faces, might have been the chamber where whatever was bound there was given form. If the family's history is a chain, Each generation seems to have added a link. The strange illnesses, the midnight gatherings, the hidden letters and sealed diaries, all signs of a pact that was not allowed to break. For centuries, they fed it. Whether it demanded lives, devotion, or something else entirely, no one outside the family could ever prove. But when the last Whitmore vanished, the pattern was interrupted. And now the question is whether the interruption freed whatever was held or left it starving. The orchard's unnatural growth, the reappearance of Philip, or something that wears his face, the strange movement inside sealed rooms, all may be signs of a thing untethered. Or perhaps the pact remains intact, tended now by unseen hands. The mansion stands as it always has, its windows dark, its walls holding more than they should. At dawn, the first light touches the roof, spilling slowly down the stone until it reaches the upper floors. One morning, a passerby claimed to see movement there, a shadow crossing behind an upstairs window, slow and deliberate. There is no one living in the house. The Whitmore story does not end so much as it folds in on itself. Waiting. Whatever bargain was struck on that land centuries ago has not been forgotten, and whether it is still being kept is a question the house itself seems in no hurry to answer.